As I arrived at the next scenic spot in my rental car, the phone rang with a call from my mother-in-law, as if she had been watching the whole time. It was my mother-in-law. I gave my husband, David, a knowing look and answered. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson, what's up?" Her voice was frantic on the other end. "Get away from David right now. Grab your bag with your clothes and head to the bus stop by the cliffs." "Mrs. Johnson? What are you talking about?" "David's planning to attack you. He's got a gun hidden in the car." So, that was the game she was playing. I can't believe David would. "Okay, I'll leave right away." My response might have sounded a bit flat, but it seemed to have convinced her. She hung up immediately. "My name's Emily Johnson, a 29-year-old office worker. I got married to David last year, but because of the COVID pandemic, we had only registered a marriage. Now that the pandemic's effects have waned, we've been able to travel. So, we're planning our belated honeymoon. My company was understanding and gave us time off for our honeymoon even though it's been a while since our marriage. We chose a national park, eager to take lots of pictures. I'm into landscape photography. David's hobby is video editing. We've even discussed starting a YouTube channel for landscape videos. We've been living a quiet but happy newlywed life. However, there's been one concern: David's mom, Mrs. Johnson. She has always been overly fond of David, her son. Since David and I decided to get married, she seemed to have it out for me at every turn. Her subtle harassments during our meetings are a frequent occurrence. And the worst part is that she does it behind David's back. If I get praised or say something at a family gathering, she'd subtly put me down. "Did you make this stew, Emily? It's an unusual recipe for around here, but it's tasty. It's really delicious. Can you share the stew recipe? If it's simple, I'd like to make it at home." "Did you like it? I'm glad. I'll write down the recipe for you right away." "It's good, Emily. But maybe learn some traditional recipes from around here too? It'll earn you more praises." That's how it usually goes. She's not praising my unique stew, she's suggesting I stick to the local recipes and not stand out. In fact, after the relatives left and it was just me and Mrs. Johnson doing the dishes, it was a barrage of sarcasm. "Always wanting to stand out, making such a salty stew. Planning on giving our family high blood pressure or something? Scary woman." "I tasted it, did you find it too salty? I'll go lighter on the salt next time." "I don't even want to eat your salty stew anymore. Make something more traditional next time." But then, when David comes around, her demeanor completely changes. "Emily, Aunt Susan said thanks for the stew recipe. Everyone really seemed to love your dish." "Really? That's great. What would you like to eat tomorrow, David? Emily and I will prepare it together." With a beaming smile, she'd interrupt our conversation, shifting the topic. It's so blatant that it's hard to even get angry about. It's become a bit of a joke for us afterward. The hilarious part is David's already caught on to her dual-faced behavior and subtle digs. Mrs. Johnson thinks her son doesn't notice, and takes every chance to berate me when he's not around. However, my husband David has already caught on, and even secretly records or films her when it gets too bad. David has always resented his mother's overbearing love, which is really just over-interference. Apparently, it's even crushed his dreams for the future. So, when we got married, it was David, not me, who refused to live with her. Despite the happy occasion, it seems like Mrs. Johnson thinks I was the one who manipulated him. Her excessive love for her son blinds her to everything around her. I worry she'll do something foolish one of these days. On another note, we've finally decided on the details for our belated honeymoon. Taking our hobbies into consideration, we decided on a trip around scenic locations within the country. I'm excitedly preparing cameras and other equipment. David is also getting a smartphone without a SIM card to take videos. We've packed a traveling bag with clothing and toiletries. We'll be able to see canyons and waterfalls on this trip. I want to take beautiful pictures, so we need to check the weather forecast too. You're right. Landscapes shrouded in mist and clouds are mysterious and beautiful, but I really hope it's sunny. We laughed together as we continued our preparations. But even at a time like this, Mrs. Johnson interferes. A phone call. It's Mrs. Johnson as expected. Hello. I answered the phone in front of David and quickly switched it to speakerphone. Hello, Emily? Are you really planning on traveling with David? You've been married for over a year, and now you're going on a honeymoon. What are you thinking? It seems she wants to stop me from traveling with my husband. The best response to this is to flaunt the trip. Of course. We finally don't have any restrictions. David's company and mine have approved the leave for our honeymoon, and we're going to enjoy ourselves to the fullest. Mrs. Johnson fell for my bait. What do you mean enjoy yourselves? It's probably just a cheap inn and a miserable trip. I feel sorry for David. Mrs. Johnson's words caused David to frown in silence. This trip was something David had arranged himself without relying on a travel agency. I looked at David's face and changed my tone. Oh, no, it's not a cheap inn at all. David arranged everything. We're staying at a super luxury hotel with an amazing view. Of course, the food is 5-star too. And yet, it's all at a very affordable price. I purposely spoke sweetly to provoke Mrs. Johnson. I'm always being picked on, and this time she was disparaging the trip that David prepared. I wouldn't feel satisfied without getting back at her a little. A super luxury hotel? Why are you going with David? Let me go on that trip. David would want to show his filial piety to me. It seems she couldn't keep quiet after hearing about the super luxury hotel. Now she's saying she wants to go on the trip herself. No mother would but in on a honeymoon like this. It's not gonna happen. Taking over your son and daughter-in-law's long-awaited honeymoon is just uncouth. We'll be sure to buy you a souvenir. Goodbye. Imagining Mrs. Johnson's frustrated face, I hung up the phone. I laughed spitefully, and David was holding his head in front of me after I hung up. Emily, I'm sorry about my mom. I can't believe she tried to take over our honeymoon. Well, she loves her son so much, she probably just wanted to say something. It's not something to worry about. I smiled at David, but I also felt a twinge of anxiety. I had beaten her at her own game with all the resentment I had built up, but I might have failed. What if the angry Mrs. Johnson became obsessed with our honeymoon and started harassing us? This worry of mine would later prove to be true. From then until the departure of the trip, there was silence from Mrs. Johnson, not even a phone call. I had expected her to complain to David about me, but that didn't happen either. Her silence was unnerving, but we went on our honeymoon as planned. David's choice of scenic locations went off without a hitch, and I was completely satisfied. The super luxury hotel I had boasted about to Mrs. Johnson was top-notch in every way: the view, the amenities, the food, everything. We even had the hotel staff take a picture of us enjoying dinner as a couple. Oh, I'm so full. David, thank you so much for arranging all this. After dinner, I collapsed on the bed in the hotel room. The bed's so soft and comfy too. Watching me happily roll around in bed, my husband David exclaimed with joy. I'm glad you like it. Once you've rested your stomach, how about we go to the spa? In the meantime, I'll check the videos and photos we took today. The spa? How wonderful. David, who had been opening his laptop while admiring me enjoying the plush bed, suddenly raised his voice after a while. What? What's going on here? Feeling an unusual sense in David's voice, I got out of bed and peered into his computer. We had rented a car to get around today. At every scenic spot we visited, we had parked the rental car and taken videos and photos, and the rental car could be seen in the background here and there. In itself, that wasn't a problem, but there were a few instances where a suspicious person, who appeared to be a small-framed woman, was lurking around the rental car. We couldn't see the face of the suspicious person, but we felt she was a petite woman. The suspicious person was occasionally opening the car door. Oh, here, we didn't lock the car because we were only there for a short time, David muttered, pointing at the screen. I recognized the hat the suspicious person was wearing. Hey, this hat, doesn't Mrs. Johnson have one like this? Yes, Mrs. Johnson has a similar hat. David's face turned pale at my words. That's right, this is my mother's hat. David and I stared intently at the computer screen. The suspicious person, who looked like Mrs. Johnson, was putting something black into the rental car. It looked like she was opening the traveling bag that had been left in the rental car. Then, after a while, the suspicious person left without taking anything. Was something put into the traveling bag? I hurriedly dumped out it. It felt strangely heavy. I hadn't noticed the difference in weight since the hotel bellman had carried it when we arrived at the hotel. It was a bag with clothing and toiletries, no valuables. Nothing seemed to be stolen. And then, something unbelievable rolled out from the bottom of the bag. David and I were stunned by what had come out.
What's this? You're kidding.
The next morning, we left the hotel with exhausted faces. We had been run ragged dealing with the incredible thing that had come out of the bag the previous day. When we arrived at the next scenic spot in the rental car, the phone rang with almost perfect timing. It was from Mrs. Johnson. I signaled to David, who was on the phone, to answer it.
Hello, Mrs. Johnson?
What's going on? Mrs. Johnson's voice on the other end of the phone sounded quite frantic.
Get away from my son right now. Grab the bag with the change of clothes and head to the Cape's bus stop.
Wait, how does she know there's a bus stop near the Cape where we're vacationing? And how does she know the details of our luggage, like the bag with the change of clothes? Since she called at the perfect timing, she's probably hiding and watching somewhere. It was a call full of puzzling moments, but I deliberately asked Mrs. Johnson for a reason.
Mrs. Johnson?
What are you talking about?
David is planning to attack you. He's hiding a gun in the car.
I see, so that's the scenario. I already knew everything, but I pretended to go along with Mrs. Johnson's leading.
That can't be, David attacking me? Okay, I understand. I'll get away right now.
Although my response was a bit wooden, I seemed to have successfully fooled Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson hung up immediately. I signaled to David, who was driving, and headed for the bus stop with the traveling bag. Of course, I didn't forget to pretend to be scared. And then I called the police. About 5 minutes later, I arrived at the Cape's bus stop, and a detective in an unmarked police car approached me. Well, it turned out just like you said yesterday. I never thought you'd really call it in. The detective looked troubled.
I'm truly sorry for involving you in this farce. I think David should be catching Mrs. Johnson by now, so please come with me.
I headed back to the rental car, and the detective followed me in his unmarked car. From the parking lot where we parked the rental car, I could hear Mrs. Johnson's voice.
Hey, David? How did you know where I was?
It seemed that Mrs. Johnson had never dreamed that her wicked scheme would be exposed in advance. She was caught by my husband, hiding in the shadows of a gazebo in the parking lot.
Not today. I will not forgive you today.
Mrs. Johnson was frightened by her husband's demon-like expression, but she was even more astonished when she saw me returning with the detective. In my hand was a traveling bag, just as Mrs. Johnson had planned. Upon seeing it, Mrs. Johnson started to scream.
Officer, arrest that woman right away. She's hiding a gun in that bag. She's trying to kill my son with it.
Mrs. Johnson shouted that and smirked at me. A triumphant look on her face. I silently stood before Mrs. Johnson and dumped the contents of the bag. Out of respect for the men's eyes, the underwear was placed in a small bag so that it could not be seen. However, the object Mrs. Johnson was after was nowhere to be found.
What? Why isn't the gun there? I put it there yesterday, it should be there.
Is this the gun you are looking for? The detective showed Mrs. Johnson a photo. It was a picture of a hunting rifle placed in a plastic bag. Upon seeing the photograph the detective presented, Mrs. Johnson's face turned pale.
That hunting rifle, it belonged to my late father-in-law, didn't it? Honestly, how did you manage to open the gun safe? I thought my heart would stop when I found it yesterday. I called the police right away and handed it over.
At mine and my husband's voices, Mrs. Johnson ground her teeth and looked down.
Oh, since it was in Emily's bag, it's Emily's fault. I have nothing to do with it.
Mrs. Johnson started yelling in desperation. My husband and I sighed deeply. But then, the detective approached Mrs. Johnson with a big smile on his face.
Yeah, Because it was in Emily's bag, we had to ask her about it. We spent hours questioning her yesterday, even though it was supposed to be a vacation. So, how did you know the hunting rifle was in Emily's bag?
Although the detective's face was smiling, his voice was low. It's no wonder he's angry. After all, the hunting rifle was taken out illegally, even though it was unloaded.
But, I saw Emily put it in her bag.
Mrs. Johnson, unable to look the detective in the face, desperately made excuses.
Oh, so you saw Emily's travel preparations. But you and Emily's family are separated, aren't you?
I chimed in with an obvious response.
Of course we're separated, and we haven't let her into our house for a year.
At that remark, Mrs. Johnson yelled back.
Don't speak out of turn.
The detective pressed Mrs. Johnson further.
Oh my, were you spying on Emily's house? If so, that's a misdemeanor, and I'm gonna have to ask you to come to the station with us.
Upon hearing the detective's line, straight out of a police drama, Mrs. Johnson panicked.
I wasn't spying. I put that gun in there. So you can't take me involuntarily.
Ah, she spilled the beans all by herself. Well, I had already said it earlier when I turned the bag inside out. The detective, who had been smiling until now, became serious.
Yes, a confession. You'll be coming with us voluntarily for violating the gun law.
At the detective's words, Mrs. Johnson opened her mouth in shock.
What? Why? I said I wasn't spying, didn't I?
Mrs. Johnson's objection was met with her son's fury.
It's only natural, Mom. You don't have a hunting license, and you took Dad's gun without permission. If the father-in-law, who had a hunting license, carried it legally for the prescribed purpose, there would be no problem. But you don't have a hunting license, so taking it out of the gun safe is out of bounds.
It seemed that Mrs. Johnson knew nothing about gun laws or handling. Even though the live ammunition was stored separately and not loaded into the gun itself, it's a wonder she managed to bring it this far without an accident. Yet Mrs. Johnson still resisted.
But when it was found at the hotel, it must have been in that woman's bag. That woman stole it from my house. It's not my fault.
At the unsightly attitude of Mrs. Johnson, her son raised his voice.
Yesterday, I caught the moment on video when Mom put a gun in our rental car. Naturally, I showed it to the police.
David's words made Mrs. Johnson's knees buckle.
What? How did you find out?
Frustration and tears welling up in her eyes, I explained in his stead.
David was filming yesterday, and he caught the parking lot in the shot. We didn't notice it at the time, but when we were reviewing the video at the hotel, we saw it.
Mrs. Johnson could no longer argue with my explanation.
Now, Mrs. Kate Johnson. We'd like you to accompany us to the station on suspicion of violating gun control laws.
The detective prompted Mrs. Johnson, who was in a state of shock, to get up. To Mrs. Johnson, David exclaimed,
Why would you do something like this? Just because you don't like Emily? I've had enough. I'm cutting ties with you, Mom.
At David's words, Mrs. Johnson suddenly began to scream and thrash about.
Why? Why is that woman better than me? David, are you abandoning your mom?
The detective forced the screaming Mrs. Johnson into the unmarked patrol car.
You might not want to make too much of a fuss. When I called the house yesterday to check the gun's serial number, your son's grandmother, I guess, an elderly woman, was furious. Eek!
At the detective's words, Mrs. Johnson immediately calmed down. The grandmother in question is David's grandmother. Although elderly, she's still in good health, with no signs of dementia. She's practically the head of the Johnson household. Mrs. Johnson is in a state of complete submission to her. Even though she's the head of the household, she's not an unreasonable person towards others. Whenever I visit the in-laws, she's always so happy to see me, affectionately calling me Emily dear. She's a kind person. Though strict with Mrs. Johnson about household chores, she took care of her own room and private bathroom. It must have been quite something to make her so angry. As I muttered under my breath, the detective informed me.
Apparently, since your father-in-law's death, your husband's grandmother has been keeping the hunting rifle as a keepsake. But the box with the keepsake in it was ransacked the other day. Upon learning that this led to the recent commotion, she was incredibly furious.
The detective exaggerated a shiver. I see, Mrs. Johnson must have ransacked her room to get the key. It's not hard to imagine her anger at having her son's keepsake disturbed. Afterwards, David spoke to the detective.
I'm not gonna pick up Mom at the police station after this.
At David's words, Mrs. Johnson's face changed to one of despair. The detective laughed and waved as he explained.
Yeah, David and Emily, you continue your vacation. Your grandmother insists on it, and her representative is on the way here.
With that, the detective left with Mrs. Johnson. David heaved a big sigh. Emily, I'm really sorry. Our vacation turned into this.
It's okay, it ended without incident. Let's just enjoy the trip, shall we?
I said, and David looked relieved. Then he quietly told me.
I'm relieved that it's not Grandma coming, but her representative. When Grandma gets really mad, she's terrifying. If she had come this time, she might have torn down the police station with her loud yelling.
After that, we were able to enjoy our vacation, taking lots of lovely photos and videos and making good memories. Mrs. Johnson was not arrested but was sent to court for violating gun control laws. Fined or imprisoned or both, she's now anxiously awaiting the trial's outcome. After we returned from our trip, my husband's grandmother apologized for Mrs. Johnson's behavior. She blamed herself for leaving her son's keepsake hunting rifle locked in the house, leading to all this trouble, and apologized in tears. We decided to have the local police dispose of the hunting rifle. When handing over the rifle at the station, I asked to take a picture of it for her, so she could at least keep a photograph as a memento. My husband's grandmother, who had cried and apologized to me and David, was ruthless with Mrs. Johnson. According to a relative who went to pick her up, she lectured Mrs. Johnson in a voice that echoed throughout the neighborhood for over 30 minutes.
Oh, so your grandma really does get that angry. That's why Mom always obeyed Grandma completely. Now the whole neighborhood knows about Mom's wrongdoing.
Yes, thanks to his grandma's lecture, the incident became widely known, and Mrs. Johnson could no longer walk the streets. After learning that David had severed ties with her, his grandmother obtained permission from the police station and prosecutor's office and sent Mrs. Johnson to a farm run by a relative. Located in a basin-like area in the remote mountains in Nebraska. Even if she wanted to return here, it would take about 3 hours by car. Working herself to exhaustion on the farm, escaping would surely be impossible. After a while, it was discovered that I was pregnant. My husband, his grandmother, and the relatives were all thrilled. His grandmother was already caught up in great-grandchild fever and began to strengthen her legs. She seems to be planning to compete with my husband to take the baby for walks in the stroller. To make sure she doesn't drop the great-grandchild when holding it, she's also started working on her upper body strength. It's good to see her, who was quite downcast because of Mrs. Johnson's fuss, getting her spirits back. Today, my husband and I are getting all the baby gear together.
If it's with your grandma, I'd like to live together. She's really happy about it, and it seems like she'll live a long time after the baby is born. Taking care of the baby with Grandma, we're gonna manage somehow, huh? Well, if she's gonna live longer, I'll be happy too, and I'll talk to Grandma about it.
I picked up the camera. When the baby is born, I'm gonna take lots of pictures. Of the baby, my husband, his grandma, and family photos as well. With such thoughts, I was rubbing my belly.